Dr. Colvin, I'm going to ask you in a moment about HCV testing. Before I do so, hepatitis B, your statement says that you had a comparatively small number of patients who were had an ongoing hepatitis B infection. Is that right?
I think we all did. We all had a very small number of hepatitis B infection patients who had an ongoing infection, yes.
And you had a larger cohort of patients who had shown some signs of being infected in the past with hepatitis
Yes, it was
B.
absolutely routine to test people for evidence of previous hepatitis B infection. To begin with, that was just something that one thought of because of the risk of hepatitis B infection from blood products. But later, of course, by '86, there was a recombinant hepatitis B vaccine. So it became really important to test people for hepatitis B or evidence of previous infection so that one could offer vaccination to those who'd not been infected, particularly, of course, small children would then become routinely vaccinated against hepatitis B.
So in terms of the hepatitis B vaccine for your patients, your recollection is that was the mid-1980s?
Yes, you see, the original hepatitis B vaccines were not recombinant, so they would have been derived from human plasma. They were almost certainly non-infective because of the way they'd been prepared and treated. But I think that by the 80s, we had already become wary of blood products, and the prospect in '86, I think it was, of a recombinant hepatitis B vaccine was very attractive.
But had you used the hepatitis B vaccine, the non-recombinant?
I'm not sure I had, actually. I really can't be sure, but I think that as soon as the recombinant vaccine became available, we all said, we've got to do this, particularly for children.
And were you aware of the possibility of sexual transmission of hepatitis B?
Yes.
And were your patients counselled about that, those who did have
well,
the
they
infection?
would have. Well, yes. I mean, there are 2 or 3 patients that I don't recall because it would have been back in the 70s probably that I would have. But I don't think we had any seroconversions from 1975 onwards. So, yes, in principle, but I don't recall the detail.
Then can I move then to the process for testing for hepatitis C? So this would have been 1991,
Yes.
Perhaps 1992, but the early 1990s. My understanding from your statement, Dr. Colvin, is that that was also done from stored sera without seeking patient consent in advance.
Correct.
And bearing in mind that this is now the early 90s,
Yep.
and you weren't in what you described as the sort of acute phase from the late 84, early
Yes.
85 of trying to deal with the HIV emergency, why was it that patients' consent was not sought for the testing?
So you've already referred to hepatitis B, and nobody ever thought of, I don't think, requesting specific consent for hepatitis B testing in the past. Maybe people were requested, maybe people did ask for permission, but I don't remember that being done. And I think that hepatitis B testing in the past would have been done without consent largely. I think so. Hepatitis A testing, of course, also was done, anti-HIV testing, also done without consent. So the next question is, well, was it appropriate to test for hepatitis C without consent when that test became available? I want to quote very briefly from the Penrose Inquiry report, if I may. May I do that?
Yes.
So in 3240 of the Penrose Inquiry report, it states as a little extract, Professor Nathanson, who at that time I think was head of ethics at the BMA, recollected that in about 86, 87, the BMA had actually voted for a policy which allowed doctors to test without consent. As soon as the policy was agreed, the BMA took legal advice, and they were advised that testing without consent was illegal. The policy was reversed the next year at the BMA's annual meeting of 600 representative doctors. In fact, the BMA had received conflicting advice from 2 QCs on the topic. The rationale of the advice, which was followed, was that because the HIV test was not a standard test, the implied consent given was therefore required. So the position as far as hepatitis C was concerned was that we'd known about hepatitis C for, I suppose, 20 years, and the patients had known as well. And so I think that the testing was part of the routine work of looking at liver function and the health care of people with non-L, non-B infection. It wasn't HIV, and the GMC guidance was about HIV testing. So it didn't really fall within the HIV testing regulations, if you like to call them that, of the GMC. There was obviously debate in the BMA, if not in the GMC, about what was appropriate. And it wouldn't be, I think, until 1999 that there was any advice that was clear from the GMC on communicable diseases in general. So I think in my mind, whilst this was not what one might describe as a completely routine test, nevertheless it fell within the area of testing which was appropriate for the consent that had been given for the liver function tests that had been performed over the previous 20 years.
Again, were the samples that you were using recent samples, or were they
They'd
older
have been, I guess,
samples?
contemporaneous samples, yes.
So they would have been taken over the months preceding the test. It would presumably have been perfectly straightforward to tell the patient that one reason why the sample was being taken was because there was by that time, a realistic hope of having an HCV test.
Well, that may indeed have been the case. We may well have talked to patients about the possibility of an anti-HCV test. Also, it's entirely possible that as the test became available, I may well have spoken to patients and they may well have given me consent for the test to be done. That's perfectly possible. I can't be sure it was. But again, I point out the logistic difficulties. We've got almost certainly over 100 patients now who might be anti-HCV positive. And these patients will be coming up over a period of up to a year. And clearly you might say, well, get them all up and invite them to be tested. And my answer is that would indeed itself have been a major logistic problem. And the view I took was that it wasn't essential and necessary for that to be done. Once I had the results, we then had the problem of how to deliver them. And you may want to talk to me about that. But we're talking now about, I'm sure, over 100 tests because we have 80 positives.
The inquiry will be looking in some detail at the different parts of ethical guidance issued by BMA, MTU, GMC over the years in due course. Do you recall whether on this issue of testing, and bearing in mind, as we've seen from the various documents we looked at from the mid-80s, it had become a topical issue in relation to HIV. Do you recall whether you discussed it with colleagues or sought any advice on the question of HCV testing?
No, I don't. I mean, I used to talk a lot to Len Doyle, who's our professor of medical ethics at Barts in London, but I don't recall discussing this with him particularly myself, no.
And whilst you're obviously right to say HCV is not HIV, they're different viruses, perhaps with different stigmas associated. Perhaps not, but they were both very serious conditions with potential for, in terms of mortality. HCV is a condition that you would have known by the early 90s could, as with AIDS, lead to serious illness and death.
All the more reason to get on with testing patients and discussing it with them.
I understand all the more reason to do the test and tell the result, but does that not distinguish the HCV testing process from a standard liver function test?
Well, it depends what you mean by distinguish and standard. It isn't a routine test. It couldn't be because it had just come into action. But there was a need to decide whether it was necessary to go back to the patients to ask for further consent. And my view at the time was, rightly or wrongly, that it wasn't essential.
Viewed with hindsight now, do you think that was the right decision, not to tell patients in advance and seek their consent to HCV testing?
I don't think it was essential.
You don't think it was essential
Yes.
to seek their consent?
Yes.
And why is that?
I think I've already explained that I felt that it was a natural progression from the liver function tests into the solving of a problem that everybody knew about, including the patients, that it would have been extremely difficult in a very short space of time to bring 100 plus patients to the hospital for pre-test counselling. But I'm not aware that any pre-test counselling went on, though it's possible it did, in this field in haemophilia care. And finally, that once again, nobody ever said to me that they shouldn't have been tested after being told of their results by me personally.
Can you recall anything about how the testing was organised? Was it done in-house at the London Hospital or externally?
No, I don't know the answer to that question. But I think Professor Collier would have certainly have been involved. I mean, he was a distinguished professor of biology, and he would have advised me, and the advice he gave me, I think, would have been taken.
And then, in terms of the numbers who tested positive, I just want to take that from your.
They're just over 80.
Statement, yeah. So we've got, I think, the precise figures in your statement. You've said you believed approximately 84 patients were found to be anti-HCV positive at the London Hospital Haemophilia Centre, and you've broken that down as Haemophilia A 62, Haemophilia B 17, von Willebrand disease 3, and Haemophilia carriers 2.
Yes, that's the figure I had in my collection of lectures.
And do you have any recollection of approximately when this was that this process of testing was undertaken, as in which calendar year?
Oh, it would be 1990.
How then did you go about the process of communicating the test results to patients?
This I can't recall precisely, but I think I've said in my statement that I believe that I would have given the patients personal information about the results. I couldn't absolutely swear that none of them received the information by post, but I'm reasonably to very confident that they would have had a personal interview with me.
And again, I appreciate I'm asking you to recall events from some time ago, but do you think they were called in for a special appointment to be informed of the result, or was it a question of at their next routine appointment they would be told the result?
It might well have been a mixture, actually. I mean, obviously people come into the hospital from time to time for advice about other things. People come in for their routine appointments. People might be concerned and ask for an early consultation, or I might find myself in a position where I had a particular consultation that I needed to undertake, and would then tell the patient. I really I'm not sure, but I don't think you can assume that it was just a matter of telling people at their routine appointment. Even if it had been that, it wouldn't have made an enormous amount of difference, although obviously there were aspects of their known infection which needed to be dealt with, and the communication needed to be done without delay.
And what information and advice in 1990, 1991 do you think you were giving the patients when you told them their diagnosis and over the months that followed?
Well, obviously I can't recall that detail. The inquiry has provided me with a document, I think from 1996, which gives a list of things that I did for people with hepatitis C infection, just as I had a list of things that I asked people to know about HIV infection. So it's quite clear I did put together a list, because an aide-memoire is very important for patients when you've been speaking to them. They don't necessarily remember exactly what you've said, or might interpret what you said incorrectly. So an aide-memoire was important. The inquiry asked me whether I remembered whether there was a previous aide-memoire, and of course I don't know.
But in terms of the information that you think you would have been giving, whether with the assistance of an aide-memoire or not, and at that initial stage of telling patients the diagnosis, because you made the point that although it was relatively newly known as hepatitis C, and the ability to test was relatively new, it was a condition which had been known about for a number of years. Yes,
if you remember the Manucci paper where I introduced the idea that some people thought that this was still a benign infection in 1982, which I know was perhaps against the run of play, as it were, against the run of advice. The paper from Charles Hay in 85 gave a really definitive view that this was a serious problem, which would have then been discussed with patients up to 1990. And then it's not very long before there's the issue of interferon therapy. And once you get to the point of interferon therapy being available, then not only is it important to know your anti-HCV status from a point of view of why your liver function tests aren't perfect, but it's also terribly important to decide whether it's appropriate for you to consider some form of treatment for this condition.
And in terms of lifestyle advice, what kind of lifestyle advice would you expect do you think you would have given in the early 90s?
Well, the main thing is, as it would be for whether there was an anti-HCV positive test or not for somebody with abnormal liver function test, one would advise on limitation of alcohol consumption. That's probably the most important thing to consider.
And how had you gone about identifying the cohort of 100 or so patients to be tested for hepatitis C?
Well, I don't remember exactly how I did that, but I would probably have looked through our register. We had a register and tried to remember who had or had not had blood products. I mean, I might have got that information from Oxford. I don't recall doing so. They had the power probably to tell me that. But by the time we get to 1990, I have been director of the Centre for up to 15 years. So in here is quite a lot of information about a very large number of patients. And of course, that's not reliable and it needs to be checked against the register or against the Oxford register. But I think that in those days before computers were that much used, because we were probably talking about 88 or something, perhaps the mid-90s, I'm not sure when the computers really become really important, but it's probably in the 90s. I'm really relying on Oxford to have the data if I ask them for it. I don't recall doing so, but I might well have done. Or my memory, or my own register at the hospital, or a combination of the three.
So in terms of the criteria, would it have been every patient who received a commercial concentrate or a NHS concentrate prior to a certain date?
No, anybody who'd ever received blood products.
So you would have been testing anyone who had received cryoprecipitate, NHS factor VIII in any incarnation, and any form of commercial concentrate, and some others.
Yes,
fever,
I mean obviously things like fever or well, we didn't use autoplex, but I mean there were all the human-derived blood products were a risk for hepatitis C infection, and of course the blood transfusion.
I'm going to ask you a little about the arrangements that were made at the London Hospital for the treatment of those, first of all, who had been found to be HIV positive. Because you were a haematologist, not a physician specialising in the care of those with HIV. Can you just outline for us, please, what the arrangements were in that second half of the 80s and up into the middle 90s, where I think you then had some specialist assistance?
Well, I'd always taken the view in the Haemophilia Centre that patients who might be coming 60 miles from their home on the southeast coast to see me should have what I might describe as a one-stop shop, so they could come to the hospital, get everything dealt with and go home. And so what I did was to link my Wednesday morning haemophilia clinic, which was also a general clinic actually, to see the people with haemophilia at the end of that clinic, and then a rheumatologist would come to see the patients that I'd selected who needed a joint doctor on that day for their joints. And for the HIV clinic to begin with, that was done on a different day from the rheumatology clinic, and the trust had appointed a counsellor, Nigel Harvey, to assist me. And what then happened was the patients who were anti-HIV positive, although we wouldn't advertise that fact, they happened to be there, and we would make sure they were there when the counsellor was available, would come and and their HIV infection would be discussed with me in my routine clinic, with Nigel present, and then if there were the need to do so, which there very well might be, then Nigel would see them separately. And indeed, there's evidence he went home to see patients. Some patients were visited in their homes.
So in terms of the treatment of HIV-related infections and/or AIDS, you were the prescribing clinician.
So I'm just coming on to that, because to begin with, of course, in 1985, 86, there's no treatment. All we can do, and it's a lot to do, is to find out for ourselves more about the natural history of the condition, to discuss with our patients the natural history of the condition, give them their list of things they should and shouldn't do, and the risks of sexual transmission, all these things, with their leaflet. And then a year or so has passed. Everybody, I think, has been informed, and I've completed my initial counselling with Nigel's help, and then AZT arrives, so azidovidin arrives. And at this point, I began to talk to my patients about the possibility of zidovudine treatment, and indeed we treat patients who wish to be treated, because since zidovudine is not that effective, and since it's not entirely clear what the indications are, patients do, of course, have a significant role to play in deciding whether they're going to be treated or not. And some patients, I know, decided they didn't want to be treated. But once we get slightly more effective treatment, it becomes apparent that, as Mark explained, there is a need for a specialist input. Of course, in his case, it's him. But for me, I knew that I now needed specialist advice about therapy beyond just zidovudine. I think I could manage zidovudine by myself. And so what I did was to go to the HIV specialist, and then we made a decision which might be regarded as controversial, to see my HIV-positive patients in the Graham Hayton unit on a Wednesday afternoon. So what I then did was do my clinic, and then instead of having the HIV clinic at the end of my morning clinic, I'd go off and have a sandwich, and then I'd go to the Graham Hayton unit, which is the sexually transmitted disease block, and separately from everything else, we would run an HIV-related haemophilia clinic. Now, you might say, what are you doing asking your patient with haemophilia to go to the sexually transmitted disease clinic? And the answer to that is that's where the specialty is, and that's where the specialist knowledge is. And I explained to my patients what I recommended, and they all agreed, because they came to the clinic and they were happy, as far as I was aware, with the arrangements. The other advantage of that, if you look at Mark's evidence, was that, of course, they immediately got access to the treatment without cost, because, as for all the authorities knew, they were part of the HIV process. And I'd just like to emphasise that in my mind, there wasn't any stigma for being HIV infected. And from my patient's point of view, although it's true they were attending the clinic which otherwise would deal with HIV for the other reasons that it could be transmitted, they were in a separate clinic where they were looked after carefully by the HIV specialist, and I was always there.
And that was, as I understand from your statement, roughly the mid-90s?
Yes.
So the first decade...
Probably a bit earlier than the mid-90s, because in 96, we get triple therapy. Now, we were certainly doing this HIV clinic in the Graham Hayton unit before 96, because I can recall, I think I've mentioned this in another context, that some patients by 96 were desperately ill, and that the introduction of triple therapy changed everything. And Mark referred to this in his evidence, that it was extremely difficult for patients who were actually dying in front of our eyes, who were prepared for death, who suddenly got better. And although you might think, well, it's wonderful to get better when you've been so ill, actually it's a very confusing time, and patients had great difficulty in coping with it.
And the counsellor to whom you've referred, that was someone from a social work background?
Yes, he was a social worker. I think he was a trained counsellor as well as a social worker.
Was that a post that was filled at the centre for the rest of the time that you were there, or was it something that was just for a few years? I
think for a few years. I can't remember when Nigel went, but he eventually went. I think that the counselling aspects were to some extent taken on, apart from by me, by the nursing staff, who were haemophilia trained nursing staff. But I think during the critical period when we were trying to sort of get used to what was happening to everybody, Nigel was there for the counselling service, but I can't remember the exact date that he left.
In terms of care of liver disease, your statement says that you set up a joint clinic with a hepatologist.
This is another of my late Wednesday morning clinics, so I know there are only certainly a number of Wednesday mornings in the week, in the month, but if we eventually settle down to probably one or two hepatitis clinics a month and one or two rheumatology clinics a month. So the emphasis was always on my trying to make sure that for every clinic appearance for my patients, they saw me with the specialist rather than going off to see a specialist separately, partly because I wanted to know what was going on with them, and partly because I wanted to make sure they knew that I was there for them. This can be extremely important in clinical practice in haemophilia care. For instance, for liver infection, it might well be that the hepatologist wants to do a liver biopsy. Well, it might be that I don't think a liver biopsy is a terribly good idea, and I then need to discuss with him or her if we're going to do a liver biopsy, under what circumstances and with what cover and when. So, for instance, doing a liver biopsy on a Friday afternoon wouldn't be something that I would be very keen on. Not that I was keen on doing liver biopsies anyway, but this relationship between a physician and a specialist, I think, is absolutely critical for haemophilia care.
I think we've got a couple of documents that give a snapshot in relation to hepatitis C provision. Henry, it's BART 0000567_001, please. This is a document completed by you in October of 1991, and it's to send to Professor Preston in Sheffield. And we can just see, you says, have you performed anti-HCV testing on your patients? Yes, first generation and second generation. What categories of patient do you test? And we can see you've tested those who'd received inactivated or treated materials, those who'd received non-virally inactivated products, and those with abnormal ALTs. You're asked if you measure ALT and AST levels in all patients. You answer yes. ALT and AST testing is 4 times a year. And then you're asked about patients with clinical features of chronic liver disease. You identified there that you have 2. You're identifying in 6 in terms of the stage of liver progression where you've got to. Are you treating any of your patients with chronic hepatitis C with interferon? No, but we're about to enter patients into a trial. What, if anything, can you recall about the interferon trial?
Oh, well, the position then was that we had all these patients who were not actually themselves ill at this point. And once again, I have a close relationship with the Royal Free. And Paul Telfer, who is now a consultant at the London, actually dealing with sickle cell disease, is at that time at the Royal Free working with Christine Lee. And he has a trial of interferon available. And it seemed to me that this would be a very good opportunity to attain knowledge about the success of interferon therapy at the same time as offering interferon therapy to some of my patients who were regarded as requiring it. Now, I don't remember the exact details of the trial, but it was of interferon alone, and it would have had entry criteria that meant you could know who was eligible and worth trying to treat with this drug. So probably through Christine Lee, or maybe I just knew Paul anyway, I said to him, and he said to me, what about this possibility? It seemed to me an ideal opportunity to offer my patients interferon therapy.
What was your experience as the clinician of your patients' experiences on interferon, both under the trial and then latterly being treated?
It's horrible. The problem is that it gives you a flu-like illness. You feel absolutely dreadful. And certainly with interferon itself, you feel so ill while you're taking it that you almost wish you hadn't started. And it's extremely difficult. It was extremely challenging to complete a full course of interferon therapy, or indeed the later dual agent therapy. And I felt very, very sorry for my patients who had to go through this awful experience when it wasn't terribly successful.
And then we can see, just continuing with the questionnaire, if we go to the next page, question 8's not answered, but question 9, are haemophiliacs with chronic liver disease seen jointly with your local gastroenterology or hepatology specialist routinely? Do you discuss with your patients abnormal LFTs and hepatitis C? You've said yes. Are you testing contacts of patients with hepatitis C for antibody to hepatitis C? You said yes. Can you recall what the outcome was in relation to the testing of spouses in sexual contacts?
I'm not aware of
referred to?
any transmission of hepatitis C in that way, and certainly my review of the literature suggests that it is extremely unusual, if not, I wouldn't say not impossible, but extremely unusual for that kind of transmission to take place. No doubt it could happen, but this raises the question of how much information it's appropriate to give to people for a risk which is exceptionally low. I mean, it's clear that I did discuss it with patients, but you'll also see from the information sheet I provided that there's quite a bit of reassurance in that sheet. But if a patient wanted to have a test, or their spouse wanted to have a test, their personal contact wanted to have a test, then of course they would be offered a test. But I'm not aware of any positives at all.
And then how many of your patients had died in the past 5 years? 14, and then you've identified 2 in which liver disease was an important contributory factor. How many had developed hepatocellular carcinoma at that stage? 0, autopsies 0, and that effectively completes the form. There is a further snapshot from 94. I'll just look at it in terms of getting some statistics into the evidence. BART 0002322_001.
But before you refer
Yes.
to that, which is just coming up, I think it's important to note that I haven't filled in this form correctly. I don't know whether you noticed this. If this is the one well, let's see what Henry produces. But I think what he's going to produce is evidence of my having misfilled the form in.
Perhaps you can assist us with how, because what I was going to just draw attention to is we've got the numbers of patients here. How many anti-HCV positive patients do you have alive? 83. 17 of those are co-infected with HIV. And then there are further questions which you answer. Which bit is filled in incorrectly?
If we can move on, Henry, I think there's a point where I've said, do you routinely carry out additional investigations in patients with intermittently elevated liver enzymes? And I've said no. And then, do you routinely carry out additional investigations in patients who are anti-HCV antibody positive with persistently abnormal liver enzymes? And I've again said no. It doesn't seem very logical and must be an error.
And in fact, you've gone on to answer
Yes, exactly.
in point 3, which of the investigations do you perform when you've identified them?
Obviously, I didn't have the chance to tell the inquiry this because I only saw the documents a couple of days ago. But you'll see that I've left liver biopsy out as one of the things that we, in collaboration with the Royal Free, by and large didn't do.
Could we just have on screen, please, Henry, BART 0000660, please. So I'm not sure if that's the right reference, Henry. Hold on. Sorry, BART 0000666. My apologies. And we can just see this is now October 1990. It's another meeting of the Haemophilia Working Party of the North East Thames Regional Association. And you and Dr. Kernoff and others are there. And if we go to the second page, there's a discussion about treatments. And we can see, I don't need to go through it in detail, but we can see little 1 and little 2 are talking, and 3, I think, talking about potential treatments for HIV. And then 4 and 5 are talking about treatments and other matters relevant to hepatitis C. It looks as though from the attendees on the first page, at this stage at least, these are matters that are being considered without specialist hepatology or HIV physician advice, at least at this meeting.
Okay.
And if we just look at the first page, you can just assist me by saying, do we have in those lists of names anyone with a hepatology or
I see what you mean.
HIV speciality?
No. Well, I mean, Peter Kernoff was his chairman just before his death, probably, or at least before his serious illness. But Christine Lee is a very important authority on haemophilia and hepatitis at the Royal Free. Of course, she would work with the people at the Royal Free, but she's a pretty authoritative view on liver disease in haemophilia, and I would have thought that she was capable of giving very sound advice, but I guess you'll be asking her anyway.
I can indeed. And then if we could just please have, again, from the same time, 1990, BART 00000573_004. We can see this is a letter being written by Dr. Kernoff, copied to you. It's to someone described as the Regional HIV and AIDS Coordinator in the North East Thames Regional Health Authority, 8th of October 1990. And the concern is being raised by Dr. Kernoff about funding for HIV care. If we look at the third paragraph, Dr. Kernoff is saying, by reference to the district, I don't know whether he's talking there just Royal Free or the region, about the large number of patients and inadequacy of existing facilities, and wanting to be able to use earmarked HIV/AIDS funding. What, if anything, can you recall about the issue at the time of trying to ensure sufficient funding for HIV care?
I think that this is probably dealt with by my transferring all our HIV care to the sexually transmitted disease unit, the Graham Hayden unit within the hospital, because I think the people with haemophilia probably just got lost financially in those arrangements. Now, exactly when I transferred to the Graham Hayden unit, I don't know, and I don't think I was necessarily thinking I was clever to bypass the financial arrangements, but I really don't recall any financial difficulty either with the haemophilia HIV practice in general, or the drugs in particular. Now, it would have been helpful, I guess, to have more counselling than was provided by the trust on a secondment basis. But that's what we had. The other great advantage of the Graham Hayden unit was, and I've mentioned this in my submission, that Colin Murray Parkes, a distinguished psychiatrist, an internationally distinguished psychiatrist, was running a service not related particularly to the patients, but for the staff within the Graham Hayden unit, and our physicians and nurses joined in that counselling service for themselves, and I also was able to secure the services of Colin Murray Parkes to look after my own patients' psychiatric needs, which were considerable.
Can I then, on a slightly different topic, ask you to look at BART 00000873_001. So this is a letter from Professor Christine Lee to you, 14th of December 1993. It's in the context of a particular piece of research funded by the Medical Research Council, and I don't need to ask you about that. We have documentation relating to that. But she says this: I find it quite ridiculous that all this work and effort is being put into getting information from death certificates. I think the only valid information from death certificates is actually the date of death. And then she goes on to talk further about the authorship of a particular paper. What was the approach that you took at the London Hospital on the issue of death certification and what to record and what not to record? And did your views accord with Professor Lee's?
First of all, I haven't a very secure memory of what I put on death certificates, because I don't remember signing very many. I'm not sure why I might not have signed very many, but I do remember on one occasion, I think, when a patient or their relative asked me not to put HIV on a death certificate, and my declining their request, because my view was that this was a matter of fact which was my responsibility to put on the death certificate. So insofar as I have a memory, I would have put HIV infection on the death certificates. As far as the research was concerned, I mean, I think, as I recall, Sarah Darby was the leading researcher in this area, which is mentioned in this letter, and she was working with UKHCDO to look at the pattern of deaths amongst the people with haemophilia and HIV in the United Kingdom. As far as authorship is concerned, I'm not sure that I would have had a particular view on.
I don't need to ask you about that. There's quite a lot of documentation about it, and we have the final study in any event. Just again on a variety of different topics, porcine factor 8. You say in your statement that that was withdrawn due to concern about the possible transmission of porcine parvovirus. Do you know when that was, approximately?
I don't know the exact date, but I mean, Ibsen took over from Spaywood, and there must be a date when the porcine factor 8 was withdrawn. It was always a rather sort of niche product in the sense that it only applied to a very small number of patients. It's a pity it was withdrawn because it was rather useful. Later, it was possible to produce recombinant porcine factor 8, although this was after my retirement. I think it's mind-bogglingly expensive. I'm not sure quite what the rules are these days on the use of porcine factor 8, but all this was at the time when everybody was getting extremely, quite rightly, nervous about any kind of virus infection. And I think the manufacturers of porcine factor 8, that's Spaywood, must have realised that there was a potential risk of parvovirus infection. Whether porcine parvovirus is actually capable of causing infection in humans, I'm really not sure. And of course, parvovirus itself doesn't produce a particularly worrying infection in most humans, but it's also a virus that's very difficult to virally inactivate. And so I suspect that with it being a niche product and then the need for some kind of recognition that it was a risk, and knowing that viral activation was either not possible or extremely difficult, the view was that it was best to withdraw it.
Next, I'll ask you about the interactions you had with pharmaceutical companies, and I'm really thinking here of the 70s, 80s, 90s. You've given some information in your statement about consultancy roles or the like that you took up after your retirement with pharmaceutical companies, but I'm talking about when you were still a practicing clinician. First of all, in terms of the decision-making as to which commercial products to use and to purchase, you've told us, I think, in answer to an earlier question from me today, that was ultimately your call. Other than issues of cost, as we've seen teased out in some of the correspondence, and leaving aside your stated preference for NHS over commercial, did anyone else seek to influence you in terms of which particular commercial products you would purchase?
Well, I think that my stated preference for NHS factor concentrate is actually extremely relevant. I was always an enthusiast and a true NHS supporter. I, like many others, had commercial representatives knocking on my door, speaking to me, trying to persuade me to use their products. I did see them, and I hope they thought I was very difficult to convince, because they had all sorts of arguments for telling me that their products were better than anybody else's. Paradoxically, when we eventually got to 8Y, I think that it was actually the best product available for a range of reasons that I can discuss with you should you wish to discuss it. But by this time, the commercial manufacturers were making lots of products which they believed, or liked to believe, had advantages and, of course, were more expensive. But as it happened, I think that the NHS Factor 8Y Volkswagen got you from A to B as reliably and more safely than some of the commercial department Ferraris.
So the purpose of pharmaceutical companies visiting clinicians such as yourself is, as I think you've recognised, to try and persuade the clinician to use their product. That's why the pharmaceutical reps are attending. Do you have any recollection of what the pharmaceutical representatives may have said to you from time to time, particularly in the late 70s, early 80s, about the viral safety of their products?
No. In fact, I mean, it was very interesting to hear that Mark Winter had access to a commercial heat-treated product in the spring of '84 when I was unaware that there was such a product available. And indeed, it wasn't available to me, and it wasn't available to the Royal Free either.
Was there were there offers of funding of training, products for patients? Were there financial incentives offered by pharmaceutical companies to you?
I can't remember whether they invited me to take these kind of advantages, if you like to call them that, but if they did, I rejected them.
We've seen from the correspondence and returns that we looked at that you did change pharmaceutical product from time to time.
Yes.
And you've already explained that your preference was to have more than one,
Yes.
So that you weren't solely reliant upon one. Again, thinking about the period really from 77 when you took over as consultant through to 1984, what factors, what reasons would lead you to change product?
I really don't remember, and I think they were, in fact, equivalent. All these products were effectively equivalent up to the time of the introduction of high-purity concentrates, which we can discuss later if you like. But I'm not aware of any particular reason that I would use any particular commercial product that wasn't related to price, because I regarded them as, frankly, equivalent in both efficacy and safety.
Can I move on to ask you about variant CJD?
Yes.
And the information that was then provided by you to your patients. There are two documents I'm going to ask you to look at. One is BART 002, sorry, BART 0002084_011. So this is a letter, November 1997. It looks like a standard form letter from you to patients. In recent weeks, there's been growing concern about the remote possibility that new VCJD might be passed on by blood transfusion or even by the transfusion of blood products. Some batches of NHS factor concentrate issued a year or two ago have recently been withdrawn because of this concern, although the concentrate has already been used up. There is, in fact, no evidence that new variant CJD can be passed on by factor concentrates, and it's very unlikely that this will occur. Nevertheless, I feel I must inform you that you were one of those who received one of the withdrawn batches of concentrate, so we can offer you a discussion about what this means. Please be assured that I do not believe that your health will be affected in any way. We've seen various standard form documents in patient records really across the country.
Yes.
This appears to be a document that you've drawn up
Yes.
yourself. Did you send out the standard form notifications as well, as far as you recall?
I believe I did, and I think this letter in itself I would regard as necessary but not sufficient. You'll see that I've included my bleep number, which is an important point, because if you tried to phone the hospital switchboard, you could wait for quite a long time, not perhaps quite as long as getting through to Virgin Media, but you did have to sometimes wait. And giving them the bleep number of me and the nursing staff was designed to make sure that patients could get to me if they were worried. In addition, I think that the number of patients we're talking about here is quite small, and I would hope and believe that we had a number of conversations with these patients that were personal, and that's why I say the letter was necessary but not sufficient. So
this is one notification you would have sent out because of the particular withdrawn batches that
yes.
are in issue here. But as far as you can recall, would you also have sent out the broader notification?
Yes, I think so. Yes, indeed.
And then we can see a little later on, this was 97, a further notification, HSOC 0004260. And we can see, again, this is a letter from you. This is January 2001. We've been notified another blood donor has developed VCJD. Our records show this donor's plasma was used to make clotting factor concentrates, and this material has now been used up, so there's no immediate action that can be taken. Do you mean by that it can't be recalled?
Yes.
We know on this occasion you/your son has received plasma concentrates prepared from the affected donor. This will be recorded. And then you emphasise there's no evidence that VCJD is spread by blood products. No one in the haemophilia community has developed it. A fact sheet is enclosed. And again, you've provided contact details. What, if anything, can you recall about how patients who received notifications such as this responded?
Well, this was a perfectly beastly time, as you can imagine, when we'd been through all the hepatitis C and HIV tragedy. And then here we are with another example of uncertainty and the likelihood or possibility, not the likelihood, but the possibility, that there might be a transmission of an agent via a blood product. So my recollection is that I had a number of extremely difficult conversations with patients, particularly parents of patients. What's the date of this letter?
This is January 2001.
Okay. Well, this is a particularly difficult time because by this time, in 1997, I don't know if we can talk about recombinants, but
we will, yes.
But by 1997, I have gone to my medical director and said, I can't do this anymore. I've got to have recombinant product for my children. Maybe I should have said for the adults as well, but I've got to have it for the children. The medical director accepted the situation, and by 1998, Frank Dobson had said yes. But I couldn't tolerate any more the delivery of plasma-derived concentrates, at least to my children. And then, of course, the recombinant for all came in sometime later. I can't remember the exact date the recombinant for all came in, but just at that time, one of the factories went down in the United States, so that we hadn't got enough recombinant to go round. Now, I can't remember whether this is exactly contemporaneous or not, but the result was that things got extremely confused. And we found ourselves, for adults, having to put patients back on plasma-derived products that when they previously had some recombinant products. And even some young children, not the very youngest children, I think some sort of adolescents may also have had to go back onto plasma-derived products. So this was a period of extreme difficulty and distress, not caused by a problem that became a major clinical problem, but caused by a problem which might have become such a clinical problem. But it was extremely uncomfortable and difficult to deal with.
I'm not, I think, going to ask you any more about recombinant, not least because you've dealt with it in your witness statement, and we have a lot of documents from UK HCDO and the Department of Health which tell the recombinant story that the inquiry can scrutinise in due course. Ultimately, however, it was a question of funding, was it not? Leaving aside the shortage that you refer to because of the particular factory problems, this came down to the Department of Health not making available sufficient funding and effectively saying it had to be sorted out on a local basis.
Obviously, a little bit more complicated than that, because the recombinant concentrates, when factor VIII recombinant factor VIII was first introduced, it contained human albumin. Now, the human albumin, I think, was safe, but it was a biological product, and therefore I think the Department of Health perhaps took the view that it was still biological, and therefore what was the point of paying all that money for the recombinant? And there was some credence for that view, although I think it was in many ways misguided. The other problem was that it was, of course, extremely expensive, and it was thought not to be affordable. But it soon became apparent that it was necessary to purchase it.
Wanted to ask you a couple of questions relating to your testimony to the Lindsay inquiry on the issue of research. So I'm not going to ask you about the specific papers that you've referred to or that we have, because we have those in documentary form. But if we could have, please, Henry, LIND 0000314, please. And could we go to page 7? So I just wanted to ask you about some evidence you give in that top paragraph. You set out there some studies that you'd had some involvement with, and then towards the last 5 lines of that answer, you say this: I guess I was doing some scientific work, particularly early scientific work in 84, certainly. I'm not sure about 83, but certainly in 84 we were looking at previously untreated patients, particularly, perhaps mildly affected patients who had not ever been treated before, and then suddenly did a treatment, partly for scientific reasons. And I wanted to ask you about what you meant there by saying partly for scientific reasons, because treatment decisions for an individual should presumably only ever be driven by clinical considerations.
Yes. I mean, I think these are actually the cryoprecipitate paper and the 8CRV paper. Now, the answer to that, I've already given the answer, I think, is that when a crisis arose, with Professor Sam Machin in that paper, gave 2 patients an early heat-treated low pool concentrate. Now, this was not something that could be planned for. As you're quite right in saying, of course, that this had to be a specific clinical indication. And in one case, it was a young woman who was truly a haemophiliac because her level of factor IX was very low, resulting, because of her genetic status. I can discuss it with you like in detail, but she had a very low level of factor VIII, unlike most carriers, and had a major crisis during pregnancy. And I was able to give her the 8CRV product from Elstree, which was a low pool, early heat-treated factor VIII concentrate. And I obtained consent, I think, from her husband to do that, and then we followed her over a period of 6 months to a year to make sure that she had not been infected. The same thing applied to the paper we looked at yesterday, which was to do with cryoprecipitate. And for all those patients, fortunately, they avoided hepatitis C and HIV infection. Now, the only science involved was the monitoring of a treatment that I decided for clinical reasons with the patient's consent to confirm the lack of any infection as a result. And that's what that means.
And would you accept as a matter of general principle that in relation to previously untreated patients, or indeed any patients, it would be wrong as a matter of principle to give a treatment that is anything other than the treatment you believe is the best treatment that's clinically indicated for that patient?
Of course, and that was exactly the situation with the use of cryoprecipitate in those patients we discussed yesterday, and the quite awful circumstances of this young woman who, if she'd been treated in any other way, I think would have definitely been exposed to HCV infection and quite possibly HIV. So this was, my view was that this was absolutely the best possible treatment for her on the day.
And if we could just go to a further reference in your evidence, which is page 26, Henry. It's the top half of the page. The first part is you're answering a question about not having a specific regime in place for previously untreated patients. I've already asked you about that, so I don't need to ask you again. But you then go on to say, what we were very aware of was that previously untreated patients obviously must be given the best available treatment. That goes without saying. That's the whole basis of modern clinical ethics. But that if we didn't know what was the best treatment, then the previously untreated patients were very suitable for inclusion in scientific studies to establish what was the best treatment. And you say that, of course, was an important part of medical progress when you don't know the difference between one treatment and another, and you believe that both are potentially the best treatment, then it's permissible with research ethics approval to study such a patient. Can I just ask you to explain a little more what you mean when you talk about not knowing the best treatment, and then the particular suitability of previously untreated patients for inclusion in scientific studies?
Well, I think this must relate to the 8Y study. So we get to the point where we're going to be treating either previously untreated patients or patients who had hardly any treatment in the past. And the question is, when we get to 1984 or 85 really, we have to decide what treatment to give a new patient. And I think the answer is that we don't know what is the safest treatment. We don't have any evidence. We know that that unheated product probably is capable of transmitting a virus. We know that, certainly by 1986, we know, or before that we suspect, that heat-treated commercial products are capable of transmitting HIV. And we believe, and hope that we believe, that the new NHS superheated 80 degrees Celsius 8Y will prove to be the best treatment for previously untreated patients. So in those circumstances, I think it was justifiable to mount the 8Y study and to contribute to it. Now, of course, it is true that I was the person who contributed more patients than anybody else to the 8Y study, but it was a fully, I think, ethical and well put together study from Oxford in which other centres participated. And in many ways, in terms of any kind of investigational work that I ever did, I think it was the best thing that I ever did. You'll be aware from my CV that I'm not an academic. I mean, it's true that I have an honorary professorship at Queen Mary for other reasons. It's true that I did some investigational work, but generally speaking, I was working to help other people with their work, I hope in an ethical way, but I wasn't an original researcher. And I was doing my best for my patients, bearing in mind what I believed was the best available treatment. And this is a very good example of where my belief, as it happens correctly, was that the best treatment for my patient was to use 8Y as soon as possible. And I relied on, admittedly, my hope that this was going to be the answer, which I think it was.
And would you agree, as a matter of principle, that if you're in the situation you describe where you don't know which is the best available treatment, you want to find out, you think that the treatment in the trial is a contender for that, that is something that needs to be spelt out to the patients who are being invited to participate in the trial? They would need to be told, we don't know which is the best, we want to, through this trial, to do it, and here are the pros and cons of different options.
Well, of course, ideally, you'd do what's known as a double-blind sort of trial, where you take your best treatment, you take your hopeful treatment, and you compare the two using a randomized process. Well, I mean, this is unthinkable in terms of investigation of previously untreated patients, because there are hardly any anyway. And to compare one of the available treatments that I just described with you with the 8Y, I think would have been quite wrong, because I suspected that any of the other treatments might transmit a virus, so I couldn't ethically do that. So the only thing I could do was to offer the 8Y in a clinical trial. Now, as far as the information sheet is concerned and the communication, I don't have a copy of the information sheet. Maybe you do, but the information sheet and the communication to put such a patient into a study would have been along the lines that things have been extremely difficult. We're trying to make the safest treatment possible. We believe this is the safest treatment. Are you willing to go into this controlled trial with proper consent and to be able to contribute the necessary samples to get the answer? So it's a little bit like the cryoprecipitate patients or the HCRV couple of patients, except that instead of being a response to, a personal response to a critical situation where I'm doing my best for my patient and then looking at them to make sure it's been all right, here we're doing a proper trial with informed consent, but it's obviously important that that consent is properly informed. And one of the things that I think was mentioned in a previous discussion was, what is proper consent? It's quite clear that just signing a form isn't enough. I was involved, I think I mentioned, with creating the patient consent form for operation at the London Hospital. And it was quite a long form. We tried to make it as short as possible, and I worked with the Professor of Medical Ethics to make it as suitable as possible. When it came to having my own knee arthroscopy, when my knee went wrong, I signed the form without actually reading it. And as I signed it, I thought, quite clearly all my work on this consent form hasn't been perhaps terribly useful, since as a receiver of the treatment, I'm not actually reading it properly. A bit of an eye-opener for me. But of course, in terms of this study, the 8Y study, essential for proper information and a proper information sheet and proper communication before entering a patient into the study. But I think it was ethical.
Just perhaps one more question before the break. Picking up on the issue that you just mentioned about consent forms, I'm not going to take you through all the various sets of UK HCDO minutes because we have them as a matter of record. Yeah. But is this right? Then in the course of the 1990s, and during part of the time when you were chair of UK HCDO, there were two particular consent issues that were being considered by UK HCDO. Yes. One was the issue of consent forms and whether there should be a written consent form for first treatment and changes of treatment, as to which my understanding for the documents is that wasn't really ever resolved in that period.
Not in my time. I think you know that I was in favour of a signed consent form for first use and for change of use, but as chairman, I wasn't able to take the group with me, not least because I think there was also anxiety in the National Blood Transfusion Service because it had never been traditional to sign consent forms for blood transfusion for reasons that we don't need to discuss, but are self-evident.
And being the potentially emergent nature of the transfusion.
Yes.
The second issue in relation to consent that emerged in UK HCDO discussions at around this time is the issue of the consent to data being held upon the UK HCDO database.
Which we've referred to earlier.
Yeah, and I can ask Professor Hay about that in due course. Yes. But I think that as part of that, advice was sought by UK HCDO from Professor Doyle.
I'm not sure he ever really gave it. I was talking to Charlie a while back, Dr. Professor Hay a while back, and he couldn't. There's reference in the information technology working party minutes that UK CDO have, that we arranged for Len to, for a fee, give us formal advice, but I don't think he necessarily ever did. But the position was that when I very unexpectedly became chairman of UK CDO, my first duty, I think, was to sort out the reference centre directors and just really the constitution of UK CDO, also to regulate the comprehensive care centres and to begin the process of national audit. And of course it was necessary for me to begin the process of putting right UK CDO from the Data Protection Act point of view, and also, as far as I could, but I was unsuccessful, to look at the position of informed consent for treatment. I'm not sure we have time for this, but just to give you an example of the difficulty of informed consent to treatment, in this period, perhaps around 2000, perhaps a bit later actually, I'm called to the emergency department on a Friday evening at 7 o'clock. And there, sitting in front of me, are a mother and father with identical twins with severe haemophilia, we find, at the age of 18 months maybe. They both got severe haemophilia. And my job then is to look at the injuries or the bruises or the hemophilia the child has got, and then to introduce to the family, who've got no family history of haemophilia, the fact they've now got two boys with severe haemophilia, probably need treatment, and have to have explained to them the whole sort of panoply of what it is to have haemophilia and how to manage it. Now, I can't remember whether the boy needed treatment that night or not, but the task for a physician, even as experienced as I was at that point, of explaining to patients what on earth this is all about, especially when it's quite likely they've already been accused of non-accidental injury by their local GP or social services. This is a monumental task which can't be completed in a month, let alone an hour. And to get informed consent, valid consent to treatment for that sort of situation is extremely difficult. Now, fortunately, by then we were using recombinant, I think. So it was a bit easier, but it would have been a quite appalling task in any other circumstances. And to get a signed consent form within an hour for an injection would have been quite impossible.
I note the time, sir, just before we break. Would you agree, but just picking up on your last answer then, that what lies at the heart of informed consent is the quality and extent of the information that's provided to the patient in circumstances which ensures that the patient understands that? And of course, there may be a huge variety of different situations, but as a matter of general principle, would you agree with that?
So I prefer the word valid consent to written consent or informed consent. Now, of course, what is or is not valid consent depends very much on all the circumstances of the case and, of course, the notes that are taken at the time. And the answer to your question, therefore, is that signed consent is not necessarily enough. Informed consent implies a one-way traffic of information, whereas the concept of valid consent implies a two-way traffic.
Thank you, sir. Is that a convenient time at which to break? I've got a number of questions on a range of issues that have been requested by core participants to come on to.
Well, I'm sure there may yet be more, so we'll take a break. It's half an hour long enough for you, do you think?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Very well. We'll meet again at 3:45.